Yeah, Elaine, over to you, and good luck. Yeah.
Thanks, Nsoesie. All right, let me share my screen. And I'm actually gonna go on video as well. Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this workshop. We're going to have several opportunities to interact, so be ready to use the chat. You can submit questions on the chat. You can ask, communicate ideas, thoughts, whatever you have in the chat. So here are some contact details for you. If you're interested, you can check out Rethé website, which Nsoesie mentioned, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in the slides, the next few slides. You can also email rethe.org if you have questions, or if you have a paper that you need a second thought on, if you need someone to just look on your paper and give you a comment. I'm also on Twitter, not very active these days, but hopefully I'll get back in that at some point. So at Rethé, we provide tools and resources that you need, that you can use to be successful in academia. And our focus is on writing. So we want to help you write better. And we're trying to build a writing community across the continent by offering workshops. Before COVID, we used to do this in person. So we'd actually go to different cities and universities and host workshops and meet people. And they're always very interactive, and people are expected to bring their papers, a draft of their papers. So as we learn, you get opportunities to work on your paper. So we have different parts of the workshop specifically focused on editing parts of papers and then getting feedback. We also offer opportunities to learn about writing for the public. So this is writing beyond your scientific audience. So you want to write for everyone to understand what you're doing. And this could be in newspapers and blogs, in scientific magazines. We have a blog as well. There are several different articles there. There are articles on how to write better. There are interviews with different scientists across the continent. And we're always looking for people to write. So if you love writing and would like to write a blog post for us, please send an email to rethe.org@gmail.com. We have a mentoring program. We've only run this one so far, hoping to have another one this year. The first one was 8 weeks. I think the second one will probably be shorter than that because it seems like people got writing fatigue at some point. But the next one will probably be shorter. But the way it works is you get one-on-one mentoring. You either work with me or you work with someone else who's volunteered, so another professor or a lecturer or someone else in a faculty position from another university that has volunteered to help with this, and then they will guide you through. So if you have a paper, you will require to have a paper actually to be part of the mentoring program. And then you have one-on-one meetings where they look at your paper and they give you feedback, they give you guidance on how to improve different portions of your paper. Then we also had group mentoring sessions, so people who could not be matched with a mentor. And those are similar to what we're doing right now, but a lot more extended. So you'll have more time to go over different portions of a manuscript and then also get feedback on your manuscript. And those are free at the moment. People always ask this question about payment. I would not say no to money, but right now we have the review sessions are free, so you can actually send in your manuscript and get feedback in that. So far we've had more than 4 workshops, almost 1,000 participants, and have edited about 35 papers. So if you're interested in getting feedback on your paper, feel free to send that. And so several of these papers have been published, and we know of people who currently have papers under review in very, very good journals in your fields. So here's an outline for this session. We're going to talk about writing in general. We talk about scientific writing, and then we talk about how to write different portions of the manuscripts. And this can be your introduction, your methods, your results, and discussion. And the idea here is to get you thinking. So if you have to write your introduction, what are the kind of things that you need to think about? these are very different for different fields. So whether you're in computer science or public health or in biology, the way people write papers in your field probably going to be different. And it also depends on what kind of paper you're writing. In this case, we're focusing more on analytical paper where you've done some form of analysis and you're presenting results. But there are different kinds of papers that you can write in your field, from just comments or opinion pieces where the structure is very different from this. But again, you still have to think about how to structure your paper and structure your ideas in a way that's easy for people to understand. So I would say take the information that I present here as a way of thinking, but you need to go back to your field and look at how people write papers in your field to make sure that whatever you write fits into that. So everyone can become an excellent writer. We're all learning to write. I am still learning to write. There's always opportunity to improve. And one way to improve on your writing is to read. Read papers in your field. Don't just read to understand the content. Read to also understand how people write. How do they structure different portions of the paper? How do they present different types of information? What are the ways in which they even organize sentences? This would inform you on how to write your own papers. And if you find a paper that you really like, you can use it like a template when you write your own papers. So always read in your field to understand how people write in your field. Also write regularly. You don't have to wait until the end of your project to write. You can start writing from the beginning, from when you have ideas and you're sorting through ideas. Writing can help you think better. It can help you see where there are flaws in your thinking, where there are limitations in your thinking. And so write regularly. It could be every day, it could be a few times a week, but find something that works for you. And always aim to improve. Don't just write the same every time. Think about what are some things that are limitations in my writing that I can work on to improve the way I write. And this leads to my last point, which is write with people. So when you write something, put it out there, get someone to read it, whether it's a peer, as a mentor, or it's a conference, or it's a journal, send it out there so someone can read and give you feedback and help you improve on your writing. And then we have the Rethé writing community, where we're happy to give you feedback either through the proofreading service that we provide, or through our mentoring service, or through workshops like this. So feel free to reach out if you need help with writing. So let's talk about scientific writing. That comes in so many different forms. But the aim is always to communicate ideas and findings to others. And this could be people in your community, or it could be the general public. So from your lab notebook, for those of you who worked in labs or currently work in labs, those are all scientific materials. To your academic journal article, those are all things that you're trying to communicate ideas and findings. So we're going to focus on the journal article in this discussion. This could also be conference papers for those of you who submit conference papers. Typical elements of a scientific paper include your title. You're always expected to have that. And different journals will have different guidelines on titles. Some will tell you your title can only be this long. Some will not specify how long your title needs to be. So if you're submitting to a journal or a conference, always check what the guidelines are. There's the author list. Also, some journals have guidelines on who should be included as an author and who should not be included as an author. And people who have contributed but don't meet the criteria for author usually gets listed in the acknowledgement section. But you also have to get their permission to list them in the acknowledgement section, because that can bring problems if someone is expected to be an author, but then they get listed in acknowledgement. And then the author addresses and other types of information like their emails and phone numbers. And then you have abstract. The abstract also can be structured differently for different audiences in different journals. So in some cases, they'll ask you specifically to structure your abstracts as introduction, methods, results, etc. In other cases, they just let you write your abstract however you want to write it, as long as it captures the main idea of your paper. And then you have your introduction, your materials and methods, or material or methods, depending on your field. Results, discussion, acknowledgements, which I already mentioned. And then you obviously have your literature cited, and then tables and illustrations. Tables and illustrations, I don't talk specifically about them in this workshop, but they're extremely important. And so if you're interested in visualizations, I have a set of visualization slides on the Data Science Africa GitHub. And I think it's also connected to my GitHub that you can find, but it's easy to find. If you go to Data Science Africa visualizations, it should come up. And I basically discuss different types of visualizations and how to think about visualizations to produce things that really capture the information you're trying to present. And then their tables, obviously, you don't want to make your tables too big, but you want to put information in your tables that will help people understand what your paper is about. And if you already listed stuff in your tables, you don't need to repeat that in your text. You just have to summarize it in your text. So don't copy every single line of information that you have in your tables and mention it exactly in your text, because then you're just repeating yourself. So these are all things that you should think about. The other thing is selecting the journal requirements, submission process, review process. So selecting a journal can be tricky. I usually, if I've written a paper that is different from something I've done before, I would go and look at similar papers or papers that I cite and see where those papers were published, and then see if those journals fit, if my paper can fit into those journals. So you can always, that's one way to do it, see where other people have published, see where your mentors have published, and use that as a way to identify the right journals for the topic you're working on. Different journals have requirements, different requirements, as I've mentioned before. The submission process also is different for different journals. A lot of journals have web-based submission processes. Some of them even do emails. So you have to check the journal submission process. The review process can be interesting depending on your field. I know people in fields where the review process can take over a year. So by the time your paper is published, you've forgotten what the paper is about. While in other fields, review process can be a matter of weeks or months, and then you actually get your paper published. So these are all things that you should be aware of before you even send your paper to a journal or to a conference. So we're going to review some general information. Some of you might be very knowledgeable about this, others might not. But I always think it's important for us to have these conversations. So good scientific writing is clear in that it avoids information that is not needed. So if I always write and rewrite, and sometimes I write and rewrite the same paragraphs 3, 4, 5 times to take out details that are not needed. So at the end of the day, you're trying to communicate. You're not really trying to impress people with your, if you have a large vocabulary and you know the dictionary from end to end, that's not the purpose of, can someone, whose kid is talking? Can you please be muted? So when you write, you want the information you present to be clear. You want people to understand it. It should also be simple, so it goes with clear as well. So avoid vague or complicated sentences. If you already said something, you don't need to keep repeating it, or unless you think it's extremely important for you to repeat information. Technical terms and jargon should only be used if necessary. If they're not necessary, then you shouldn't use it. And I think if you're writing for a journal that is focused on a broader audience beyond a particular field, then it's very important to be careful how you use technical terms and jargon, because if I'm reading a paper and I have to keep going to a dictionary, or I have to keep going online to find what different things mean, then I lose interest in that paper. So you want to write your paper in a way that is easy for people to understand without having them do all this extra work to understand it. You should also be impartial in that you avoid making general statements, assumptions. So everyone knows that this is, or it can be proved that, unless if you have something to back it up. So if someone has done something, even if someone has done something, don't say everyone knows, because everyone probably doesn't know. But if you're making a statement, make sure that you have reference to back up that information. It should also be structured logically. So your ideas and processes should be expressed in a way that's logical. And different sections of the paper will require you to write differently. So if you're writing in your method section, you should write in a way that it follows the process by which you did your analysis, so someone else can replicate that. It should be accurate, so also goes back to stuff we've mentioned before. So use precise information. So if you've measured something, say this is what the measurement is, the temperature is 35 degrees Celsius, instead of approximately. So if you've done any kinds of calculation and you have exact measurements, list those. And also should be objective. So your statements and ideas should be supported by evidence, as I mentioned. So let's go over writing complete sentences. Some people have challenges with this, and you end up seeing fragments in papers instead of complete sentences. So a complete sentence basically expresses a complete thought, and it contains both the subject and the predicate. So here are a few examples. So in the first case, we're dealing with a fragment because the sentence is incomplete in the sense that we don't really know what is happening. So mandasi all over the table, we don't have a verb. In the second sentence, we now have a verb, and so now we have a complete thought in a sense. And then we have things like run-on sentences, which seem to go on forever, or just to express in a way that does not capture the thought for us to understand easily. So here's an example. I thought the ride would never end. My eyes were crossed and my fingers were numb. And you can break that into two sentences and have the first sentence that focuses on the ride, and then the second sentence that talks about your eyes and your fingers. Fragments are not always bad. In scientific writing, usually they are bad. But if you're writing for a general audience, let's say for a magazine, sometimes you can use fragments to capture or to create dramatic effect. Like you could say 5.6 million COVID cases, full stop. That's a fragment, but it creates a dramatic effect in that you've pulled the reader's attention to that particular fact. So you can use fragments in ways that are effective, but usually when you're writing for a journal or a conference, it usually doesn't work. So sentence length is something to always think about. So when you write your sentences, go back and read the sentences and decide if every word that you've put in that sentence is necessary. And if it's not, cut it out. Different people have different ways in which to determine whether a sentence is long or not, but your goal at the end of the day is always to communicate. So use a sentence length that allows you to communicate clearly. Using more than 25 words, I think is a lot in a sentence, unless it's absolutely necessary. So always think about, if you're writing a long sentence, think about ways in which you could simplify it to make it easier for people to understand. So a few examples are on the right. So the first one says, at the present time, we're conducting new experiments. You can say currently we're conducting new experiments. So you just lost 3 words in that sentence that were not necessary. And the second sentence, which says existing research suggests A is better than B, you could say research suggests A is better than B, because we know the research already exists. So we don't really need existing research. So these are little things that you can think about when you write, especially if you have a limit on the number of words that you can have in a paper. Deleting these extra words in sentences will definitely make your paper stronger and easier to read. As I mentioned, if you have long sentences, you always want to think about how to simplify them and break them up. So here's an example where we're breaking a sentence to 2 or more sentences. So the speaker, though he paid $15,000 to attend the conference, probably felt that the egg on his face was not worth it. And he must still be wondering how a person once all-powerful could have been subjected to such ignominy. So a place here where we could cut this sentence up is where we have the and. So this is a good place to create a new sentence, and we can just create two shorter sentences from this long sentence, and we're still expressing the same thought, the same information. So here's our first exercise, and you should put responses in the chat. So break this sentence into two or more sentences. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. So the first answer is the intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the stairs. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. Assuming a he, yeah, I don't think we need to assume this person is a he, but you can go with a he or she or they, whatever you prefer. Well, this is an exercise, so you don't have to be perfect. The idea is to get you thinking how you can work with sentences. The intruder entered through the window and tiptoed down the stairs. He stood under and waited in the shadows. So that's incomplete. The intruder entered through the window. They tiptoed down the hall and stood on the stairwell. They waited in the shadows. So there's some really good examples coming in. The intruder broke in the window and tiptoed down the stairs. She stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. You can also add a couple of words to make it work for you if it doesn't work as it is. The intruder entered through the window, tiptoed down the hall, and stood under the stairwell. They waited in the shadows. Oh, I like that too. Lots of very good examples. So here are the two that I have. The intruder entered through the window. She tiptoed down the hall and stood under the stairwell, waiting in the shadows. The intruder who had entered through the window tiptoed down the hall. He stood under the stairwell and waited in the shadows. So I think the examples that I have seen are really good. And so yes, as Jade mentioned, some of them have suspense in them. That's exciting. So the next thing we're going to talk about is parts of a paragraph. So in the paragraph, we have a topic sentence, we have the body of the paragraph, and we have a closing. So your topic sentence tells your reader what the paragraph is about. It doesn't always have to be the first sentence, but it has to be written in a way that it's easy for someone to see and understand that's the topic sentence, right? So when I say it has to be written in the way that it works, it could be the second sentence, it could be the third sentence, but it should be written in the way that when someone reads it, they understand this is what the paragraph is about. And your body contains the main part of the paragraph. So this is where you put everything else to support your topic sentence or the topic of the paragraph. And then your closing comes after all the details that have been included in your body. And it can summarize the paragraph, it can remind your readers of the topic, and it can link the paragraph to the next one. So it doesn't have to do all of those three, but it can do all of those three at the same time. looks like I repeated the slide. So arranging details in the paragraph. So when you do scientific writing, it usually requires you to deductive reasoning. And this basically implies that your information is organized from the general to the specific. And this makes complex concepts easier to understand. When you write for the general public, usually it's the other way around, where you're starting from the specific to the general. So when you're writing for a magazine, sometimes we'll tell you that we need you to write contrary to how you usually write in a scientific, when you're doing a scientific paper. So here's an example where we're starting from the general and then going to the specific. So I'm just gonna give you a couple of minutes to read this, and feel free to comment on anything that you observe. It's a good point. Each sentence speaks a word or idea in the previous sentence and then elaborates on it. So the sentences are connected to each other. So someone is asking about the reference format Y224. So that's the reference format for the journal. So different journals will have different ways in which they want you to cite your references. So this is how the journal preferred. So you do square brackets and insert the number. Others will use superscripts. Some might use just different ways in which they like to produce. You might use footnotes or other ways in which they like you to organize your references. Another good point, so we start from the global and then go to specific American stats. Yeah, so this is just an example. Your writing does not have to be the same, but in this case, we're starting from what is the problem globally, and then what is the problem in the US, and then we start talking about some of the reasons why this problem exists based on all the studies that have been done. The closing left us in the air. That's interesting. That's interesting. So we will talk about this a little bit more later on, and we do have the sentence linked to the next sentence or the next paragraph, so you're not left in the air. So in the methods section, you need to organize your information in a chronological order because you want people to understand what you did. So sometimes when you run an experiment or do an analysis, you might run things in a particular way, but then you have to go back and redo it. We don't need to know all of that. What we want to know is if I were to reproduce your work, what are the steps that I need to take? What is step 1? What is step 2? What is step 3? What is step 4? And so forth. So you should always present your methods in a way that someone else can follow and reproduce the process. So let's go into specific sections of a scientific paper. So as I mentioned before, there are differences in language and structure for different fields. Always requires critical thinking and a lot of hard work. Some people have asked me about how do you critique someone else's work when maybe you're starting up, this is your first paper. So there are certain things that you can do. It doesn't mean like you don't have to go in and critique everything that someone has written, Sometimes you can agree with everything they've written, but sometimes you can identify limitations based on what they already discussed in their limitation section, if they have one. I don't know if that's very prevalent in computer science, but in public health, you can't publish a paper without mentioning limitations, because there are limitations in every single work you do. So usually when you send your paper out for review and you don't mention limitations, it will come back and they'll ask you for limitation. So you can see where the gaps in the paper based on the limitations, but you can also look at the overall way in which people do analysis. What are the assumptions that they make? So assumptions tend to drive how we do our analysis, and those assumptions can also limit the conclusions that we draw from the analysis that we've done. Question what you read and do. So this doesn't just apply to other people's work, it also applies to your work. So when you read a paper, here are some things that you can think about, especially if you're doing a literature review and you want to critique a paper. What assumptions are the authors making? Is the paper representative of the population? Who is included, who is excluded? Are the results generalizable? So can you generalize it from that? Can you apply it beyond the population that's included in the study? Are the methods unbiased? What are some of the assumptions that the authors have made? Is there another way of approaching this question or problem that is different from what is being presented? And what could happen if you're working, especially in AI, what could happen if this tool is deployed? Who would be affected, who would not be affected? So what are other things that you can think about when you're reading a research paper? What are questions that you ask when you're reading a research paper? Please discuss in the chat. Yep. How are the results validated? What are alternative testing? So the things that people put in the chat. What's the point of this research? That's a very good question. Why was this method used? Is the methodology clear? All of these are really great questions. What motivated the choice of the metrics used? What are the aims and objectives? So those should always be clear. What are the contributions of the paper? Good point. So so Chris is asking, could you consider if the authors have grants and from whom, perhaps funding from a particular company might bias the results? Yes, that's definitely a good question when you're talking about conflict of interest. So people are expected to reveal their conflict of interest in their papers. Not everyone does it, but it's as an academic, you're expected to do that. So when you write a paper and you've received money from anyone, any company that might benefit from that research, you need to, or you're expected to disclose conflicts of interest. Some of the journals that I have published in would send you a conflict of interest form and ask you to fill it, and you will not get published unless you fill one of those forms. If the numerical estimates were provided, was the sensitivity analysis done, and how was uncertainty measured? Good question. Any alternative methods than what you did? Good question. And what other areas are there for application? What are the key points in each paragraph? Those are all good questions. And these are ways that you can think even when you're learning to write. So if you're reading papers in your fields, these are some of the questions that you can be asking. How are people making decisions about those different things? And that will help you think about how you can make decisions for your own project and your own papers as you learn. Why did you take this approach instead of approach X, Y, Z? That's a very good question. And in some cases, In my field, usually you get reviewers come back and ask you, why did you choose this particular method? And can you explain why this method is better than this other method? Sometimes they will push for you to do another method, and it's not always because they understand the other method better. Sometimes because they've seen it in the news or they think it's very cool. And then you have to explain why going with a simpler approach, for example, is better than going with a more complicated approach. So let's talk a bit about the literature review. So a lot of fields expect you to follow up talk topic, how to do this word is hard for me. How do you respond to reviews? That's a very good point. Actually, let me talk about it a bit. So usually, when I get back a paper, if the reviews are really long, and my first response is never the first one I send, because I'm usually not very happy when I write my first response. And then I would go back and then read through every single comment with the perspective that the person who has written this comment is trying to understand my paper better. So instead of going with the assumption of like, reviewer B really hates me and does not know what they're talking about, I would think, okay, reviewer B does not fully understand what I have written about based on the information I've provided so far, either because I have information hidden in places that they can't see, or they're not very familiar with the topic. So how do I respond to them in a way that can help them understand the paper better? If they're asking for additional analysis, which is beyond the scope of the study, I would politely say, this is what the study has done so far. This is what we aim to do. Here are goals, and here's how we've met those goals. And we can't go beyond that at this point, but in a future study, we can do that. And so I would include that in my discussion and say, in future analysis, there are other things that we can consider. If they're maybe talking about things that I've already written about, maybe they're asking the question and saying, you didn't discuss this point, but the point is right there in the paper. I would usually say, we've added additional information on this particular thing that you mentioned so that it's easier for you to understand. And that could be just adding the extra sentence. Maybe the point is in the place that they couldn't see. Or it could also be moving it to a different section so that it's easier for them to follow. So at the end of the day, the goal is to make sure that you respond to what the reviewers are asking, but also make sure that like your paper does not become something other than what you were trying to write. And sometimes with academic research, sometimes you would respond to reviewers' comments and send them back, and then your paper still gets rejected. And that can be very frustrating. And I would just take the comments that the reviewers have provided, make the paper better, and then resubmit somewhere else. Sometimes I'll even resubmit to a better journal than the initial journal that I submitted to. So reviewers' comments can be useful and can definitely improve your paper. So for your literature review, I know most fields require people to do this. You want to define your topic clearly. So you can make it very simple, so it's easier for you to find information. Also, you want to look for information across multiple platforms, whatever platforms you tend to use in your field. Try to include as many of those as possible and define a way for searching. So you could say, I'm only going to include papers that discuss this topic in the abstract. So or included in the topic, in the title and the abstract. Especially if you're working in a space where people publish very often, it's very important for you to define what you want to include. It's very easy to end up with too much information that you then have to go through. So having, first of all, a very clearly defined topic will help you only find the kinds of information that you need. Search and research. So in the time, and this is also very relevant when if you're working in the field where people tend to publish very often. So if in the time when you do your initial search and you're submitting your paper, you might already have new publications that might come up in the review process. So you want to research and see if there are any new papers that you should be mentioning. So for me, I wrote a paper once, and as I was working on the paper, right before I submitted it, one of my colleagues published a very similar paper. And I had to decide whether to acknowledge that that paper had been published or completely ignore that paper. And I decided to acknowledge it because I figured it would come up in the review process. So I read their paper, identified limitations in their paper, and then included it in mine and said, this is another paper that has been published in the topic. It's similar, but yes, how our paper is different. And here are the questions that our paper answers that their paper does not answer. Take notes while reading. That's very important. I found that very useful, especially if you have to go back and reference things. So instead of reading an entire paper, you can just look at your notes for that particular paper. Keep your review focused. Also goes back to defining a clear topic, and be critical and consistent. So there are definitely ways that you can be critical by asking the kinds of questions that we talked about before. You can find limitations in papers and you can highlight those limitations, but also remember to always highlight those trends as well. So the goal is not to attack people. The goal is to see where are gaps in knowledge that you can fill with your work. So any questions? I'm gonna pause now and take questions before we go into the different sections of the paper. So Moses, can you clarify what your question is? So reading many papers for, are you asking if you should read many papers or you should read fewer papers? Which is better? Okay. If you're reading a paper to include in your manuscript, the goal is to read the paper thoroughly. So whether it's many papers or few papers, you want to read them thoroughly and present them in your paper in the right way. So I've seen papers sometimes that cite my paper, and I don't think they should have cited my paper because it really doesn't fit into what you're talking about. And I think I might have mentioned one sentence and then referenced someone else's paper, and then they include that. So it's important to read every single paper thoroughly before you decide whether to include it or not. And read many, few, it's very subjective. For some people, 30 is not many. For other people, 30 is many. So you have to decide what is the right number for you. What is the right number for the paper that you're writing? So if you're writing a paper that covers a topic that has been studied for a long time and there are lots of references, then you might have to include lots of references. But one way to go about that is to look at review papers. So if people do review papers in your field, look at what they've discussed in those review papers, because review papers tend to include several different papers. So you could have 100 papers summarizing a review paper. So in that way, you can reference a review paper instead of reading 100 papers. The next question is, how does one deal with all the reference papers in the actual paper you're reading? Some are important to read, but you usually find yourself in a sequel of reading papers. What is your advice? That's a good question. Usually I focus on information that I want to cite. So if I've read a paper and there is a particular statistics that is listed and it's referencing a different paper, then I will go find the original paper that generated the statistics. Sometimes you have to go several papers to find the original paper. But I would only go down this hole of reading all the papers unless I'll only go down that hole if I have to go down that process. And it's usually because there's a particular thing that I want to cite. Otherwise, I stick to the papers that I've originally selected for references. What if someone read only one paper, referencing the paper and its corresponding citations without reading them? I think this is a tricky thing because sometimes you read a paper that references another paper, and then you assume that the paper that's referenced is the right paper, that you think it has the information that is being referenced in that paper. And you might be surprised, and this has happened before, where the papers that people reference, like you keep going down that hole and trying to find where the original numbers came from, and you really don't find them. And so it's very important, especially if there's a particular thing that you're interested in referencing, you should check the original source. What did the original source say? And we're humans, which means that sometimes we read something and we change it. The way that we reference is different from how the original individual intended for it to be. So I would still always check the original sources of information. Next question, how do you narrow your search so that you don't get overwhelmed by the vast amount of information? How do you know when to stop? Very, very good question. So starting with a very specific topic or specific question can help you narrow your search. And you can always refine your question. So if you search the first time and end up with 10,000 results, you can say, okay, this is a lot. How do I refine the question such that it's only capturing what I want? Depending on what kind of literature review you want to do. Sometimes some people will put a date limit. So they would say, I'm going to search from 2004 to 2020. 2020, and they'll get that information. Others might say, I only want papers that specifically use the method. So instead of just mentioning the particular method, I want papers that use that method. That's one criteria that you can put. You can also say, I'm only going to focus on papers that do answer this question in a particular way, using a particular type of analysis, or are very clear that they're aiming to answer this question. And it's not just something that they mention in the discussion section of your paper, but they're actually trying to answer that question in the analysis. So there are different ways in which you can limit the amount of information that you end up working with. And I would say check how other people have done literature review in your field and see how they go about limiting information that they include in the studies. Next question, any tips on how to know before reading the whole 20 pages of the paper that it will be useful for your own paper? So I tend to read the title and then I read the abstract. If the abstract contains the information that I need, then I read the whole paper. So I'm trying to think, what's a good example? Let's say, so I did a paper that reviewed methods for forecasting influenza pandemics, and this was after the 2009, is it in 2009 or 2000? Yeah, the last pandemic we have, which a lot of people don't talk about. And I looked at methods that people had used to make forecasting. And the way I decided on whether a paper would fit is if the paper specifically talked about forecasting in their abstract. So if the paper does not say our goal is to forecast influenza epidemics or the pandemic, then it wasn't included in my literature review. So you can make those kinds of decisions and say, I need specific information in the abstract, and then I'll decide whether to include it or not. The next question is, how is the best way of remembering the content of the paper that you may sometimes refer in daily talks, scientific meetings, or anywhere? If it's your own paper, I would say just read it. If it's another paper, I would say read it. If you're going to refer to a particular paper, then you should read it. And if you think that it has too much information for you to remember, then copy and paste some of that information in your slides and quote it directly and reference the original paper. So make it easier for yourself. So if I have too many slides and I think that at some points I might get tired and might not remember what I need to talk about, I would just include information on the slides, so that way it reminds me. Or sometimes you just read it. I know it's not the best way to do presentations, but sometimes you're tired and you can't think of what you need to say. You just read the information, it's right there on your slides. So the next question is, you refer a lot to taking advice from experts in the field, but what happens if you find yourself in an overlapping niche where strategies are not standardized? Yeah, that's a good question. If you're in a field where the approaches are not very well defined, then you maybe want to go with the closest. So if you're working in a field like, so let me use computational digital epidemiology, for example, digital epidemiology specifically. So several years ago, a lot of the journals, when you wrote a paper in digital epidemiology using data from places like Twitter or Google, they were more skeptical of it. So finding a journal to publish papers was a lot harder. There were only a few journals that were willing to publish these kinds of papers. But today, there are a lot more journals that deal with digital health or digital medicine that are more willing, or data science that are willing to publish these kinds of papers. So it has changed over time, and there's more space and more options in terms of choosing journals. And even traditional journals, I'm not sure who was drawing lines on the screen, but even traditional journals would also publish papers in the field now. So this changed over time. So at the beginning, I would say, find what is the closest to that particular field, especially if you're combining multiple fields together. Find which one is the closest and see if you can use help from experts in that space to help guide you as you formulate ideas for that particular topic or particular field that you're working in. Next question is, impact factor only needed to judge paper quality? Oh my, impact factor. There's so much discussion that's happened about impact factors in the last several years, and people have come up with new ways of deciding on the paper's impact. And how, because you have examples where you have a paper that may be published in a low impact journal, but the paper has changed an entire field, or it's had significant impact on how people do things in the field. And you look at the citations, and there might be only 3 citations for that paper. And it's really hard to judge impact basically by looking at impact factor or looking at citations. So I would say, when choosing the journal, yes, impact factor does help in terms of the fact that it represents how often papers are being cited in that journal. But you should also think about where your paper fits best. So impact factor should not only be the only thing you use in making decisions. You should look at the journal as a whole, also look at where other people in your field are publishing. So instead of constantly aiming for Nature and you know your paper is not going to get into Nature, look at what are the journals in your field that people are reading and publishing in, because putting your paper in those places means it will get read by people in your space. All right, so I take the next two questions and then move on. We talk of publishing journals and conferences, but the rates for young researcher publishing is costly. I completely agree. I've had people who are not in academia who ask me, like, what do you get paid to publish? And I tell them, I actually have to pay a journal to publish my paper, and they're so shocked. So yes, the whole space is really, really messed up. So I agree, and I think some journals are trying to help with that. So they would give you, they'll either say you don't need to pay. If you're from a developing country, they would say you don't need to pay any of the fees, or they would give a discount. So always check the journals, what they talk about, especially the open access journals. What are your guidelines? What are they going after? And then contact them. If it's not clearly stated on the journal website, contact them and ask about that. But I do agree. I think cost is a major, it definitely impacts many young researchers as they try to publish. So last question from Chris. On the topic of impact factor, are there ways to identify underdog papers and avoid falling into the trap of contributing to the snowballing effect created by high impact factor papers? So one way of identifying underdog papers, I think, is defining. So if you define your topic very clearly, then it's easy for you to find papers that might not be highly referenced. And also, don't just ignore a paper because it's not highly referenced. People reference papers for different reasons, whether it's because of the journal or because they like the paper or because the paper is actually great. So if you see a paper that has few citations or has no citations, don't ignore it. It's definitely worth reading and seeing whether it fits into your topic or whether there's information in there that can be useful to you. So let's move into discussing sections of the paper. So when you're writing the introduction, you want to provide enough information so that if someone is reading it, they understand what the paper is about, and they don't have to go read other papers to understand what your paper is about. So your readers should be able to understand and evaluate the results of your study by just reading your paper, right? So the introduction should explain why the study is happening and should state it in a way that is brief and clear. So you can put it in a sentence, you can put it in multiple sentences, but it should be explained in a way that someone can read and find it quite easily, and understand why your study should exist in the first place. So here are some simple rules to think about when you're writing an introduction to a paper. Again, your introduction can differ from one field to another. Clearly state the problem to be investigated. So what are you trying to solve? As we just talked about, literature review is very important to orient your reader. State the major contribution of your paper, and if it differs from previous studies, state that. If it's similar to previous studies, state that, and then state what is contributing, what is new. So it might be similar to 5 other studies that have been done, but what is a new thing that you're bringing? It could be that a lot of the work has been done in Western countries, and your application is specific to an African countries. That is a major contribution, and you should state that. State the major results. So this depends on the journal. So some journals in my field will ask you to tell your major results at the end of your introduction. That's before you even go to your methods, while others don't want you to do that. So always check what the journal guidelines are. So we're going to talk a bit about this paper. You've already seen this. This is a paper that we published in 20, and you can't remember dates anymore. This is 2016, 2018? Feels like whatever. 2018, I think. And we looked at using deep learning to examine association of the built environment. So that's everything around us with the prevalence of obesity in the US. So this is the first paragraph. You've already seen this. And what I want to highlight is that we started with the general information, as we've mentioned. So we started with the burden of disease globally, and then we go to specifics. So what does it look like in the US? And then we did a lot of literature review, and you're going to see this in the next paragraphs. But there's been a lot published on obesity because it's a major risk factor for so many other diseases. So there are lots of people studying this from different angles. So there were lots of papers to read for this, and we had to decide what papers were relevant and what to include and what not to include. So then the third sentence starts talking about how this is a complex issue that's been linked to so many different things because lots of people are studying this. And then the fourth sentence now starts indicating that we're talking about behavior, but then we're linking behavior to what happens around us. So there are things like social environment and the built environment that also affect our behaviors. And then we go down again and say, okay, now we're going to focus on the built environment. And here are the issues that have been linked to obesity in the built environment. So there's a lot of, we're going from general to more specific and more specific in this paragraph. So this is the second paragraph. As I mentioned, we did a lot of literature review. So you have references from 8 to 26. So most of these were actually review papers. So we have some papers that maybe were not captured in reviews, or papers that had specific information that we wanted to include. And so we referenced those papers separately. But when I started studying this, I realized there was so much work that had been done. And so I decided I'm going to look at review papers. And then if there is anything else that I need to learn, I will go look at other additional papers. So in this paragraph, we're basically reviewing studies that have been done. And as you can see, we're able to write like a sentence that references so many papers because a lot of the papers talk about similar things. So they might focus on walkability. So if an environment is walkable, do people have lower obesity prevalence, or land use, or the area of residence, or access to resources. So they might focus on these different things, but you see that across multiple papers. And so it's easy to combine that information to a single sentence or multiple sentences. So this is the third paragraph. So actually, I'm going to go back to the second one. So in the second paragraph, we talk about what everyone else has done, all those wonderful studies that have been done. And then in the third paragraph, we start with despite. So from the beginning of that paragraph, we're trying to say, okay, people have done amazing things, but yeah, the limitations in what has happened. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just read this and feel free to comment. So one comment is that it highlights gaps in the literature and presents a theoretical need, consistent approaches, and a practical real-world need useful for intervention and prevention. It's a very good point. So discuss potential limitations in inconsistency and cost, and end with need for use. Yeah, so this paragraph is basically starting to make our case for why our study is important. So we're saying, yes, there's been amazing work. There's been so many studies, but these studies are not perfect. The way in which they're being done can be costly and time consuming. And so we should be thinking of other ways to deal with this, with these kinds of studies where we're linking the environment to obesity outcomes, because it is important for us to do. And one other thing I also want to highlight is, sorry, go back. So one other thing I want to highlight is that we're referencing studies even when we're talking about limitations. So we're saying that we're not the only people we've highlighted as limitations. There have been review studies that have highlighted these limitations, and so we're just backing that up. Sometimes there are no studies that have highlighted the limitations that you see in what's being done, and you might be the first one to state that, and that's okay. All right, so yeah, it's the last paragraph. Again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to read. Yes, another good point. The fact that this association between obesity and built environment is well documented does not mean there's no more room for research. And so for many other, and yeah, so that's true for many other research fields and factors. So that's a good reminder. So yeah, if just because a field has been researched does not mean that there are not new ways to do things, or your ideas do not matter. You can definitely make a contribution to it. So this is where I was talking about finding that one of my colleagues had published a paper while we were getting ready to submit our paper. And so that's where I get to mention their study, that they did do a similar study. And yes, the limitation of your study and what we are adding to this field. So during this pandemic, we've seen a lot of papers that are basically almost identical, because people are asking the same questions at the same time. And so people are publishing about very similar papers, and it's working fine. But I've also had like similar experiences before, even now, where I wrote a paper and then I went to a conference and found that someone was giving a talk with exactly the same title as my paper. And I completely freaked out because it's like, did someone steal my paper? And then my mentor at the time told me to go to the talk and meet this person, that they're actually a very nice person and very collaborative. So then I went to their talk, listen to them present my paper, basically. And then I approached them and said, I'm working on the same paper. It's actually been sent out to review. I'm waiting for comments. And then we talked, and they said they actually decided right before they gave their talk to change the way they were doing their study. So they no longer wanted to just do exactly what I had done. They wanted to do something a little bit different. And so we exchanged papers, and they commented on my paper, I commented on their paper, and then my paper got published first, so they actually cited my paper. So that was a very good, that turned out to be really good. I know it doesn't always turn out that way, but if you see someone else either working on the same topic as you, don't always assume that it's going to turn out bad. Sometimes it's worth just having that conversation and see if you can collaborate. Maybe you can even combine efforts and produce one paper, or find out how their paper is different from yours, and if there are ways that you can, additional analysis that you can do to make your paper stand out from theirs. So any questions on the introduction? Key question, yeah. Let's assume CNN or CCN to be a novel technique in which paragraph could better explain and define what it is. Is it necessary to define something new here in the introduction? I think it is. So you can definitely mention in the introduction why you're using CCN, for example, in your analysis. You can say, so if you're coming to a space where people have traditionally done things one way, and then now you're saying it's another way to do it, it's definitely worth mentioning that in the introduction. It's definitely worth saying, this is what I'm doing, and yes, why I'm doing it. All right, so let's talk about the materials and methods section. Again, this can differ for different fields, but the purpose is usually to provide enough details so that someone in your space, in your field, can reproduce your work. So when you write materials for people that do work that involves materials, you want to include exact details, quantities, measurements, whether you're measuring temperature or you're measuring things in other units, you want to state exactly what the units are and what the quantities are. If you're working with animals or plants or other organisms, you want to mention that as well. If you have human subject research, you want to discuss that as well. And if you have a process for getting your study approved, you want to go through that process because it will be asked for depending on the journal that you're submitting to. And even if the journal doesn't ask for it, it's important for you as a researcher to take an ethical approach to your research. So think about, what does it mean if I'm working with people? What does it mean for me to make sure that people's data is safe? What does it mean for me to make sure that people understand that I'm using your data? So do the best you can to make sure people are informed, to make sure that your study is ethical. So the methods should be presented chronologically, as we've talked about before. Use subheadings. Subheadings help you organize information so that people can digest them better. So if you did analysis 1, analysis 2, then you can put those in subheadings and explain what those analyses were. If it's only a couple of sentences, then you probably don't need a subheading. Be precise. Also, don't have one subheading. That doesn't make sense. You should, if you're doing subheadings, have multiple. So be precise, still state the exact measurements, as I mentioned. State your methods of investigation and reason for selecting method if necessary. So if you're working with a new technique, state why you're using that new technique, what makes it better from existing techniques that others, or current techniques that others have been using for a long time. Do not overstate ordinary statistical methods. So if you're doing things that are already well known, you're doing a t-test, for example, you're doing ANOVA, for example, you don't need to write a whole paragraph about what a t-test is because people already know that. And there are lots and lots of references that you can send people to if they want to learn about the history of t-test. Add references and additional detail for advanced or unusual statistical methods. So this is important, especially when you're introducing a new method. You want people to know that this method, this is where it's coming from. If you want to learn more about it, here's where you're going to find that information. But in your summary of that method, you should provide enough details so that someone understands what the method is and why it's important for you to use it in that context. So we're going to go through another example. So this one is focused on methods specifically. So this is another study where we collected information that people were writing about reviews for restaurants online. And we wanted to see if the foods that people were saying that they were getting sick from were the same foods that we were getting from the Centers for Disease Control for outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. So if people implicating the same foods that we were seeing being implicated in outbreaks. So our first section of the methods is the data sources. You will see this in most of my papers because I tend to either work with new data sources or have to collect data that is not traditionally used in my field. And so I always have a section that just talks about the data. So again, just give you a couple of minutes to read. So mentioning dates is very important. So you want to know people to know, you want your readers to know when your data was collected. So what time period does it represent? Because data changes all the time, what people put out there, whether it's online or through other types of data collection, you can get different information from one year to another. So specifying what years your data was collected for is very important. You can also specify the volume of your data. And that's, some journals require you to do that actually. So then the next subheading is the analysis. And for analysis, we did keyword matching as our first step of analysis. So this is pretty straightforward. So we made a list of keywords that were related to foodborne illnesses and then extracted all the reviews that contained those keywords. I also want to highlight the references to the tables. So we have like table A.2 and table A.5. These tables contain a lot of information. So instead of repeating the same information, you just say, see this table for additional information. So in the table, you have a lot more keywords, and here we just give examples. So if someone wants to see more, they go look at the table. So our next subsection is classification criteria. So on here, we're saying, what did we focus on? We focus on the personal reports and reports of eyewitness accounts. So someone says, I went out with my friend got sick. So they saw it happen even though they didn't experience it. And then we talked about what kinds of information we were extracting from the reviews. So of course, your section, your subsections in your studies will be different, but using subheadings guides your readers through what you've done and helps them to see what are the different things that you focused on. And then we did another section, which is, this one is focused on bias and cluster analysis. So again, what was our next step of analysis? So if someone wanted to reproduce what we've done, they just have to go through the subheadings. So this is where the data came from. Yes, the first thing they did. Yes, the second thing they did, and so forth. Any questions? So the next paper basically goes through the same thing. It's very similar. I have realized, and I have a very interesting template for writing stuff, and I tend to follow it over and over again. So the next paper, again, we start with data. We talk about how the data was gathered, and then we go through and talk about what are the different things. So data gathering for this paper was a lot more intense. So we talk about how we had to create a database to link two different data sources together, and then make sure that they made sense. So these took up the first time we did this project, it took about 80% of our time. So there was a lot more writing about data processing for this paper. You can also do things like, so in this paragraph, we said our first aim. Basically, that helps direct the reader to exactly what you're trying to do. So saying things like, our first aim was this, our second aim was this, and yes, how we accomplished it can definitely help your reader as they read through your paper. So someone is asking, what is the difference between methodology and methods and material? It's the same thing. It's just different people have different preferences of words, but you can call it methods, so you can call it methodology. All right, so someone said in more theoretical papers, they tend to use methodology. And this also differs for different fields. So for some fields, methods is very standard. For other fields, you see people use methodology a lot more. And then we talk about data processing for this paper. And again, the first sentence starts with, our second project aim was to do this. And then yes, how we basically went about accomplishing that specific aim. And this was actually written after the first review, specifying what the aims were, because the reviewer came back and said, you've done a lot of analysis, but it's not clear to me exactly what you're trying to accomplish. So we added those sentences that specifically said what our aims were. So this is our first aim, and here's how we accomplished it, and this is the second aim, and here's how we accomplished it. Another subheading was identifying reports of unsafe food products. So the goal of this paper was similar to the first one, but instead of looking at reports of just the reports of people saying they're sick, we're looking at what are the products that are making people sick. So if you look at our subheadings, again, you follow through what the methods were, what kinds of analysis we did, and how we basically arrived at our conclusions. I think that's the last one for the results section. The method section. Questions? I know doing these things online can be so disconnected, but we can pause and take a few questions if people have questions. Okay, if there are no questions, let's keep going. So the next section is writing the results. So your results are the most important section of your paper. If you're writing an analytical paper, they're the most important. Your whole paper either stands or falls based on your results. So if your results are not clear and people can't understand what exactly you've accomplished with this study, then your paper is not very useful. State your results in the results section. List your methods in the methods section. This is what is usually expected for most journals, but sometimes you read some journals and you see the methods in the results sections or see the results in the methods section. So people have combined things, and the journal requires you to do this because the way they structure the papers might be different from how papers are traditionally structured. So always check journal guidelines to see what they expect and how things are written. So in some papers, you will see people discuss the method and then right after that, say what the results were for that particular analysis, and then keep doing that for the rest of the paper. Always choose what you want to present. So if you've done lots of experiments, lots of analysis, think about what is most important. What do you want your audience to take away? So if someone is reading your paper, what do you want them to remember? And present that information. You might also have so many things happen during your analysis, and maybe you had to go back and restart everything. You don't need to tell all of that story. Think about what did you find the first time or the second time. What do you want to present? And if someone had to reproduce your study, can they go through the steps in your methods to produce what you're presenting in your results? So some simple rules to remember: always look at journal guidelines. You don't need to repeat information in tables or figures in the text. Make sure that your results are straight to the point. Use statistics to create summaries. And again, as I mentioned, your whole paper stands or falls on the basis of the results. So it's always important to think about your results and what you want people to remember. So here's another example. This one is on monitoring influenza epidemics in China with search data. So I like this paper because the results section was very short. So I'm going to give you a minute to read through this. This is the second paragraph of the, well, second and third paragraphs of the results. So in some fields, people are expected to combine results and discussion. So you shouldn't, so in some cases you will see people discussing the methods and the discussion, but in this case, we had a separate discussion section. So we just stated the results and then discussed the discussion later. So a question, when should one use the term note that? In my understanding, it's usually used for additional comments that are not necessarily the main point. But in the first paragraph, it seems to be good for a very important reason, that this is a good indicator for influenza in China. Yeah, I don't know if there's specific rules for this, but I would use it if I want to draw attention to something. So if I am writing and going on, but I want the reader to remember a specific point, I would say note that. I think it captures people's attention and forces them to note whatever it is you want them to note. Yeah, so a question about having the meaning of the results in the paragraph. So yeah, so the results in this case, we do say that what we're finding is significant, but we don't really go into discussion into what that means in the broader sense. So we do that in the discussion section, which is the next section. But again, for some fields, you will have the result and discussion section combined. So people talk about the results and they talk about why the results are important. So the discussion is usually hardest section to write for most people because it's not always clearly defined and people don't always know what's included. Discussions for some fields can be very long because people try to cover everything, but there's certain things that I think about. I want to state what my results are. So don't be shy, discuss the significance of your work. So if you have findings, say why those findings are important. State what the findings are without basically copying and pasting your results. So in a sense, you reiterate the results, but maybe I should edit that sentence. So you're restating, you're saying this are the results and yeah, that's why they're important, but you don't need to copy exactly everything that you said in the results. So point out exceptions in your findings. So if there are things that you find that are different from what other people have found, if your results are very, so a good example is the obesity paper that I mentioned. One of the reviewers said, your results are too significant. We've never seen this before. There shouldn't be this higher correlation between the built environment and obesity. But the problem was there weren't other studies to compare to. So we didn't have prior studies that had done this comprehensively. Most studies either looked at one thing. So they would look at the density of fast food restaurants or the density of grocery stores or walkability of a particular environment. So they weren't looking at the built environment as a comprehensive measure. So there was nothing that we could compare to. So our response was, here are the closest studies that we could find to our study, but there is no study that has done the same thing. So we can't really say that our results are extremely different because there's nothing to compare to. So then you should also show how your results agree or disagree with previous findings, and clearly state your conclusions and provide evidence to support each. You should also leave limitations, especially if it's required in your field. Think about what are some of the limitations that come in with the assumptions you made in your analysis, and list those. And then you can talk about how to deal with those limitations in a future study, if you have a chance to do a future study. Here's an example. We can go through this quickly. So using Galician search query data to monitor influenza epidemics. So instead of looking at what the general public is searching for on Google, for example, we are looking at a clinician database to see what clinicians are searching for. So if someone comes in with an illness, sometimes clinicians have to look up extra information to see if the conclusions that they're drawing are correct, or if there are different medications that have been tried in the past. And so we collected that data and see if that could predict influenza outbreaks in the US. And so this is what our discussion looks like. So we start by talking about our findings. So our findings demonstrate that combining a robust dynamic methodology and subject matter experts search activity more accurately predicts influenza activity than the well-established internet-based tool Google Flu Trends. So if you don't know about Google Flu Trends and you're interested, you should definitely check it out. But it was a tool that was developed by Google to predict influenza epidemics. And then later on had some issues and was discontinued. So we say how our method is better than that, and then we go into specifics and then list exactly why our approach is important and what are the significance of this particular methodology that we're presenting. And then the second paragraph, we talk more about that. And we even talk about future things that we could do. So this will motivate the need for future research aimed at testing the accuracy of our methodology at state and city levels and potentially in the prediction of other diseases. And then we talk about limitations in our data. So it seems a major limitation in this paper was the data. Sometimes you have limitations in the methods, sometimes you have limitations in whether it's choosing your parameters for a particular model. So there are other types of limitations that might exist in your study, and it's definitely worth mentioning. And this helps, especially if you're developing a tool that can be adopted and used in a real world setting. By knowing what the limitations are, people know where they can apply that tool and where they cannot apply that tool. And then finally, we have our conclusions. So after you've talked about your limitations, your conclusions are basically a way to say, even though these limitations exist in analysis, here's why the work we've done is super awesome. All right. I can go through the abstract really quickly, but I think that's the last section. So most people tend to write the abstract after the paper is complete. And whether your abstract is structured or unstructured, here are some things that you want to capture: the main objective of the study, why the study was done, including any specific details about materials. You also want to state your methods without including too much detail, and then you summarize the most important results and their significance. So some journals will allow citations in abstracts, but most do not. You also want to avoid abbreviations because most people will not know what the abbreviations mean. And if your goal is to reach a broader audience, then definitely avoid abbreviations so that people can understand what your paper is about. So there's the references, and that's it. I think we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So what is your advice to junior or young scientists with ambition of becoming great scientists? What are the things to consider in becoming successful scientists? So how do you define successful scientist, first of all? I would say if you're working in research, you want to learn what other people have done. So look at how other people think through questions, what kinds of questions people are answering in your field, and then try to learn from that. I had a teacher who used to read papers and mostly focus on the limitations sections of studies. And he did this for several papers that were published in Nature and Science journals. And he would go to the paper, read the paper, and then look at limitations, and then start a study that focused on the limitations specifically, and then publish the paper in the same journal as the original paper. And so look at what people have done, but also look at what are the gaps that you can fill. What are some new things that you can do? Try to think, I don't know, I don't have like a 5-point process, so I'm trying to make up what I knew based on personal experience. I read a lot. I read a lot of other people's work and try to understand how they think about things, and then figure out how I can think about things maybe differently, or what are the new questions that I can ask. Find a community of people who are working in your space, whether it's people that are your peers or people that are much older, and talk to them, learn from them, seek help. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And also don't be afraid to fail. Like sometimes you would do something and it doesn't work. And this happens to me all the time. I've written many studies that never got published, or explored questions that didn't get published. And sometimes I've rewritten papers years after they got rejected and then they got published. So don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to ask questions that might not get published. It's okay. In the process, you learn and you grow. And always put things out there. Let people critique your work. Let people ask questions. It will help you grow. Next questions. What are your thoughts and our experience in African bias towards researchers in African institutions by editors and reviewers when it's discretional and not blind review? That's a very good point. And I think that's something we need to change. There are lots of fields now that talk a lot about decolonizing research. In my field, in global health, there's a lot of discussion around decolonizing global health, because if you look at the journals that get cited, they're all in Western countries. If you look at papers that tend to receive the most attention, they're mostly in Western countries. And I think part of why I started Rethe is to change that, because I believe that Africans and African institutions are producing research that is as good as research from any part of the world, and we deserve to be getting that attention. And so I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's definitely something that we need to keep talking about and demand change. In your view, when does one abbreviate a term in a paper? When does one abbreviate a term? So you want to abbreviate a term the first time you use it. So if it's something that you think that people will remember and you think it's important to abbreviate it, do it the first time you use it. And then after that, you can use the abbreviation. What are skills required for a great scientific paper in a company, and how is it different from academia? So if you're writing the paper to be published in an academic journal, then it's not really different. If you're writing a blog or an essay, then that might be different. So you want to use a language that is easier for people to understand. Academic language is not always easy to understand. So when I write for scientific magazines, I have to think differently. I have to think, if my sister who is not in my field was reading this, would she understand it? And so that means that sometimes I write the same sentence over and over again. So the first time I write it, it usually reads much like an academic paper, and then I have to go back and rewrite, thinking about what people who are not in my space, people who might not even be interested in what I'm doing, might find interesting or might be able to understand. Are there other crucial methods of scientific information communication to consider outside of journal articles? Yes, so you can write a blog. A lot of people are doing that these days. You can write for scientific magazines. You can write for online newspapers. So there are several different opportunities, spaces where you can write. And there are also some of these online news sources are focused specifically on academic research, and they encourage academics to write for them. One of them is The Conversation, and I think there's The Conversation Africa. So you should definitely check that out if that's something you're interested in. African journals also don't get exposure. Perhaps the current pandemic opens the world up to us in Africa, one positive. Yeah, I think there is a lot of research that's being done about COVID in Africa, and my hope is that people would pay attention to the work that's coming out of the continent, and that we wouldn't just get excited when, a Western institution publishes something about Africa, because that always makes me so angry. So yes, it is a hope that definitely there will be more attention being paid to work that's coming out of the continent. So Chris wants to know, what is my personal approach to writing a paper? For example, some prefer to finish the practical work first and then to write it up, since a lot of the write-up might change if you've pivoted your approach during the practical bits. I write while I do research. So I write a lot. I write a lot of things that never make it into the paper, but that's my personal preference. But what I have learned is that I think better when I write. So if I actually make the time to write down what my assumptions are, sometimes I realize those assumptions are wrong and they need to change. So I find it really useful to write while I'm working. And something that you can always write while you're working is the introduction. So if you've decided what the paper is supposed to be about, you can definitely write your introduction while you're working. Even if your methods change, you might only need to change a few sentences in the introduction.
Okay. Wow. Actually, I should say thanks, Elaine, and also like almost perfectly keeping to the time. It is impressive to me on that part. I just wanted to also thank everybody who stayed on for the whole period. Just something that you should know, Elaine, also in South Africa, we are having rolling power cuts at the moment. So we did have some people drop off. There were
I see.
questions specifically about trying to get access to your slides, and you can just email them to me. Okay with that. And then for everybody, I'll work on packaging the video later on. It's 5 p.m. so I'll probably just do it sometime over the weekend, but not immediately. So just expect that by Monday you'll get access to the video. There'll be a blog post. As Elaine said, we are covering all of these on as blog posts, just covering the talk and the video and any slides or other resources that have been made available on there. I did just put up a link to our newsletter. That's basically where any invitations to future seminars are going to be. At the moment, the way it is, I think there'll be maybe 2 sessions that are coming up, might be on language in terms of natural language processing and machine learning. Just be careful kind of on that. And we might then have also something covering data collection via internet scraping and some of the challenges that you might face, especially on the African continent, when it comes to dealing with things like copyright. So we think that's interesting as a data scientist, because you want to do things in as best a way as possible, respecting the content that you use. And trying to go through that. And there will be a future seminar by the Lacuna Fund, which is a new fund that I'm on the steering committee for, that has just launched, looking at funding data collection, especially for machine learning aligned work across the African continent. Currently, we have a call out for agriculture data. The next call that's about to be out is going to be on natural language processing, and then there will be another call on health in the near future. So exciting times, and I want to say a very big thank you to Elaine, and also spending kind of this early morning on her time.
It was fun.
And a really great set of resources, and also kind of getting us to think on that. So yeah, everybody, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day, and enjoy your weekend if you're finishing off your day, and enjoy your Friday if you're starting off the day.
All right, thanks. Bye, everyone.